So we're at that combination of these two. Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa makes the point that we only need to be talking about, considering, trying to understand one thing. We don't need to talk about two things. It's interesting, the scholars that we'll be considering use both, and I, for one, am going to keep my eyes open, my mind open to whether they go along with him, that only one is needed, that the two are contained in one. Emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising as the meaning of emptiness. We don't need, he's saying only one of these is necessary. And we don't need to choose one of them. And in fact, he seems arbitrarily sometimes to choose one and sometimes to choose the other. I have no insight into why he chooses one or the other at any particular time. Maybe you can come up with some reason. Now we keep coming back to the same quotes. Those which are produced from causes and conditions are not produced. And as the note here says, there are sources. It's not Hopkins who adds in. Of course, because this is indented, this is Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa speaking, and he's quoting Tsong-kha-pa's medium-length exposition, Stages of the Path, which is sometimes called the small exposition, just because it's not as long as the great exposition. But what I'm leading to, what I'm trying to get into talking about is what's in the quote in brackets is not from, I mean, it's added from Hopkins, but is added from not, it's added from Hopkins from sources. Okay? So then Tsong-kha-pa explains the third line, and you can read all this. If you have questions, speak up, but you not only have eyes to see, but the background of having read these many times. But it's really powerful to read these again and again. Contingent on. I'll go to Virginia if you go. If you don't go, I'll go. If you don't go, I won't go. Sorry. That's opposite. Sometimes it is that way. If you don't go, I'll go. I'll be happy to be there if you're not there. I want a break. So, and then Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa makes the comment, which is what I was just talking about. In accordance with that statement, This combination must be understood in one essential. Why am I shouting? In case the microphone doesn't get it. I haven't even had time to shave. Must be understood in one essential without being commented upon individually in a twofold way. Emptiness meaning of dependent arising, and dependent arising is the meaning of emptiness. Therefore, and then here he turns it around. Earlier he said, dependent arising going, dependent arising goes as the meaning of emptiness. But now when he introduces, when he gets down to the point he's been leading to, he says, emptiness goes as the meaning of dependent arising. So he's going to unite these two perspectives in one realization. And I go on to call this his crown jewel. That all this crown jewel, I was thinking, that's very British and Indian and so forth, bringing in another vocabulary. So Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa quotes Tsong-kha-pa's lesser essence of eloquence. As I remember, Guntang Kunjo Tembe Dreme, when he looks into why Tsong-kha-pa quotes the the end of the essence of eloquence to explore the meaning of the term essence of eloquence, to figure out what Tsong-kha-pa's greater the essence of eloquence means. Tsong-kha-pa says at the end of the small essence of eloquence, that is to say, his praise of dependent arising, a very famous text. He says that emptiness is the essence of all of Buddha's eloquence. His well-explained sutras and tantras, all eloquence here, Lekshe in Tibetan, Subhashita in Sanskrit. So what is Tsong-kha-pa's eloquence? It's his sutras and his tantras. And what is the essence of all of that? It's emptiness. And he doesn't have to explain why it's the essence, because one has to understand emptiness thoroughly in order to overcome the obstructions to liberation and the obstructions to omniscience. That, again, doesn't have to be explained, because one wants to help everyone. One wants to overcome the obstructions to liberation from cyclic existence and the obstructions to omniscience, so that you can help others in the most effective way. So the essence of all of Buddha's eloquence, generally nowadays people refer to these as his scriptures, but it's his spoken word and his, as I call it, high sayings. In Tibetan, sung rap. The rap. I had to figure out some way to say rap. Sung means speech, spoken word. Rap is an intensifier. So it's in his book called Essence of Eloquence, it's the essence of eloquence. That's why I put the before essence. The essence of Buddha's eloquence. So what's the essence? If you just left it, no, I'm just giving my reason for translating it the way I do. If it was just essence of eloquence, it could mean, as it often does with this title, that my own book has an essence of eloquence. In other words, my own book is really eloquent. And many Tibetan books name their books that way. It's an advertisement for the book, for my book, that I've really written well. It's very eloquent, and it therefore has an essence of eloquence. And titles, one doesn't have to hold back on the title, much as when we in our type of publications don't hold back on the back cover. On the back cover, we put out a real advertisement, and we'll say, all sorts of nice stuff about our own books. And I suppose put a whole lot in the title. Not so much. But I put a lot in my titles. I would say something, splash a lot about Tibetan Buddhism, because I was making the case that Tibet has its own Buddhism. Because people used to say that Tibetan Buddhism was just a minor offshoot of Indian Buddhism. Or on the other side, it was some barbarian's view, barbarian type of Chinese Buddhism. And so my project, back when I was starting to publish, was to use these books as a platform for establishing Tibetan Buddhism as a thing itself. And now that doesn't need to be made. So on my tombstone, you can write, this is one of the things he was trying to do. And people will say, why was he trying to do that? I mean, everybody knows. And some people might say, if they were smart enough, they might say, well, he must have succeeded. But if you do succeed at such things, you should never point out that you are trying to succeed. You should just let it succeed and never mention that you were instrumental in getting this accomplished. Really. You said that when emptiness is seen as the meaning of dependent arising, you see? Emptiness is the meaning of dependent arising. You see, whereas when this started, if you go back to the beginning, Tsong-kha-pa said, what did he say? I forget the line. I'm going to explain dependent arising. That was in the initial line from the three principal aspects of the path. Strive at the meaning of dependent arising. Now, when Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa gets down to make his point, it's pretty much like strive at the meaning of emptiness. You said that when emptiness is seen as the meaning of dependent arising, See, it's a different take. In the emptiness of inherent existence, even the feasibility of objects and agents is not contradictory. So we have two different takes, which are, so Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa is establishing the rightness of his beginning by talking about the three principal aspects of the path in that stanza where Tsong-kha-pa says, strive, Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa, strive at realizing Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa. I get frazzled so easily. I don't know if it's age or what. Strive.
The means of realizing, dependent arising.
Thank you.
Method.
Strive at the means of realizing, dependent arising. But you see, when Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa finally gets down to his crown jewel explanation, he frames it a different way. And he gets his source here from the praise of dependent arising, the lesser essence of eloquence. You see, and this has to be the reason why he uses this title, Essence of Eloquence, because the essence is emptiness. Now I know why he used this title, because the essence is emptiness. Wow. In his great commentary, Ocean of Reasoning, on the 24th chapter, so you see, this begins again, since it is frequently said, the meaning of emptiness, the emptiness of inherent self, meaning of. So this was quoted earlier. I'm sure you've all, I'm joking, memorized this from your early encounter, right? Which is repeated here. And remember that this contrasts a bit with how his student Gyaltsab, right, who was sitting at Tsong-kha-pa's feet. It was really wonderful to go to Ganden and see the reconstructed room that had been destroyed in the cultural, what names, cultural revolution. People took me in and said, this is where. It didn't say, the person didn't say to me, this is the reconstructed room where Tsong-kha-pa, right? Replica where. They just said, this is the room where. Why? Because they reconstructed exactly where, that room. They didn't say, the person told me, this is the room. They weren't, I wasn't asking for specific things. I just wanted people to give me what they figured I wanted to see. It was really wonderful. And to give it with the aura of being in that room. His Holiness told me, which is very interesting, that they should not have rebuilt the monastery on that very hill. They should have left the hill, bombed out, and built it on the opposite hill, on the hill, not opposite, but just across the way. Rebuilt it over there and left it bombed out.
Why?
You think about it. He didn't tell me. And one thing goes through my mind, and I won't dwell on this. I have a proclivity to dwell on things. The room in which Gang Gyatso was killed, was murdered, for speaking out against, it wasn't the room where he spoke out, but he's a person who volubly spoke out against the people who supported Shukden. He's a person who was voluble. He's a voluble person. One of my teachers, because I studied at Senyi Laptra for a few months, doing Uma. They took a lot of pictures. And in a separate room across the way, made I don't want to use the word museum, a whatever, cultural center with those pictures. And then fixed up the room, restored the room, so that people could come see his room by way of pictures. Quite different. Which is quite striking to go see it. Full of pictures. Full. Okay, stop. So, you've read this before. I recommend going back and reading Gyaltsab's, what Tsong-kha-pa taught Gyaltsab, whether it was, I assume it was before Tsong-kha-pa put his own teaching to, wrote it down, but who knows. Gyaltsab might not have had a copy, Then, Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa says, after that quote, let me explain this in the style of making additions to the words. In Tibetan, this is dru-nirmpa, adding syllables, adding words. I've had to translate this many times recently in the book that I'm attempting to finish. The end game always takes a lot of time. As augmenting. You're augmenting by adding syllables, words. And the way that Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa says it, says it very humbly, in accordance with what I can figure out, in accordance with what I can. In Tibetan, it's le bokpa. The figure out is English colloquialism. Now, I added this is totally from me, understandings of. I think the experience of this is such that emptiness and dependent arising, when you reflect on emptiness, But I mean, the way it works is that your understanding of the one bestows understanding on the other. And I use the word sprout here. I'm, as you know, I'm tending to use the word stalk, something more substantial. And again, this comes from my own experience as a child, looking at the small shoot coming out of a seed and being shocked that the seed and the sprout exist at the same time. Obviously coming from predispositions experiences in the former lifetime, and probably never having looked at the seed and looking at the tiny shoot being there at the same time, which has no bearing on the topic at all. So I'm trying to make it clear based on that understanding, based on that shock as a little kid. So now, when Hopkins, out at the margin, says the sequence, he's giving commentary in order to help, supposedly, one read the help readers as they go through Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa's explanation. A person generates an inferential consciousness and inference. So I wanted to, instead of just saying inference, one could just say inference, which is obviously a consciousness. Realizing that a sprout does not inherently exist because of being independent arising. Now, one way as you're reading Tan-dar-lha-ram-pa, it can almost seem as if when he says this is for somebody who has realized, realizes emptiness with valid cognition, is that all you need? And all this happens? Or does this mean for somebody who has realized emptiness with valid cognition, then as you develop, it gets richer and richer, and you're able, as you get used to emptiness and dependent arising more and more, there's this mutual reinforcement and greater, So this second realization occurs only upon attainment of the first realization of emptiness and not before. So does it immediately come? Or through greater and greater understanding of emptiness, does this promote more and more understanding of dependent arising, such that the two understandings promote greater and greater, I'm learning not to talk through my hands, greater and greater mutual development, such that the one promotes greater understanding of the other. So now refurbish your understanding of these, which we talked a great deal about earlier. Now, if we take the time now to go over these again, we'll never advance. But if you don't refurbish your understanding and go over the earlier discussions, you won't develop also. So we have to move on. Now, first he wants to go into the autonomy branch of the middle way school. What is Thurman called the autonomy branch? Dogmatic? Is that what he says?
Dogmaticist, I think.
Yeah. The autonomous became very, very famous in India and carried the day. But then somehow, through Atisha and that tradition carried the day to a great extent, but also the so-called autonomous who were not known by that name in India, but came to be known by that name in Tibet. It still had a tremendous name, and still even in Tibet, although the consequentialists had more of a name, more predominance in Tibet, although the Gelugpas and others incorporated a great deal of the autonomous writings into their own study in Tibet. So I don't get Bob's reasons. Usually I like to find a reason in people's translation equivalents, but here I haven't found it yet for Bob's translation. Okay, in which it is asserted that other valid cognitions must be involved, such as that initially the property of the subject is established. Now, remember we said there are the two. Whatever is a dependent arising. Are these the two we used? Whatever is a dependent arising is necessarily not inherently existent. Are these the two? Correct me. That was one. And the other one is this one. My body, for instance, is dependent arising. Now you're going to put the pervasion first and the property of the subject second, or are you going to put the property of the subject first and the pervasion second? The entailment. Pervasion and entailment are the same thing from different points of view. Here, he's putting the property of the subject first. The subject is my body. My body is a dependent arising. Because, remember, a couple months ago, 6 weeks ago, because it arises in dependence upon the mushy stuff inside my mother's womb. It has arisen in dependence upon the mushy stuff inside my mother's womb. This has arisen in dependence upon, if we take it back to, a certain way back, Ora Adams Hopkins had in her womb some, egg and sperm fused sometime after either Christmas 1939 or New Year's Eve 1940. I was born September 30th. Rose Independence on that. They got a little tipsy. Or my father went down and drank Christmas Eve, drank the cocoa that was put out for Santa Claus. And they got happy that they had filled the stockings, the 3 stockings for my 3 brothers. And went at it. It would take a little while, wouldn't it? A couple of days. No, it would take anyway for these 2 elements. Ora and Charlie. They're 2 elements from their body were together. That's an interesting thought. Take it back to that. Okay. Thinking very concretely.
Jeffrey, I had an idea about the term dogmacist for the autonomy. Maybe you can shoot it down if it's no good. But it's because, like, the drashe, or the explanation of the phrasing of Rangyupa, they say it's because they accept the Rangyugi Ta, right? The autonomous syllogisms. And that means, like, the syllogisms such that the person who is the proper vessel to realize the proof, to realize the predicate, they, that, each of the 3 modes are inherently established, and to the mind, or the valid cognizer, realizing each of the 3 modes, that the actual 3 modes are established the way they appear. So, like a person who's, as a valid cognizer, realizing that the sprout is dependent arising, to them the sprout is appearing inherently existent, and it exists that way. So maybe it's dogmatic with respect to that the appearance exists as, the sprout exists the way it appears for the person who's, realizing the 3 modes.
Yeah. Exists the way it appears because they have that particular dogma. Tsong-kha-pa makes great effort to show that consequentialists do assert syllogisms. Great effort. That they do have assertions. And so you're, of course, most correct to point out that they have a particular assertion. And Nagarjuna does use the word assertion, because I have no assertions. And so that in effect, and Tsong-kha-pa points out, because I have no assertions of inherent existence. So that could be a justification of because I have no dogma. So I have no dogma that is an assertion, that is to say, an assertion of inherent existence. And even Nagarjuna uses the word assertion, that is to say, dogma, when it comes to an inherent existence. And if Bob means that, yeah, well, let's defend Bob that way, okay? Because I'm always looking for ways of backing up other people's ways of translation. And so no, Bob doesn't have to mean that. Let's say he means that, and take it as meaning that. We don't need to put an if on it. Yeah, good. So Nagarjuna himself says, "I have no assertions, therefore." So a lot of people take, and I'm not saying Bob does. Nagarjuna is meaning, I don't have any assertions about anything, and I just shut my mouth. And T.R.V. Murthy, for instance, has in his book Central Philosophy of Buddhism, says, I can't figure out what Nagarjuna's path is. I can't figure out what Nagarjuna's meditations are. I can't figure out how Nagarjuna develops insight into emptiness. Is it just spontaneous? Does it just suddenly dawn on you? And that's why, together with my original thesis advisor, Richard Robinson, over lunch in the faculty club at the University of Wisconsin, I presented my idea of writing a thesis on meditation on emptiness, because there's so much on this, contrary to Murthy, whom I had read with tremendous interest and gotten so much out of what he wrote, that this would be something to add to the scholarship on emptiness. And he wholeheartedly agreed. Okay? See you next week.